Principal Howard Jenkins kicks a black girl named Alana out of school. But just 5 minutes later, karma strikes in an unexpected way and ruins his life. As the tables turn and the truth unravels, how will Howard face the consequences of his actions? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Principal Howard Jenkins stood at the front of the staff room, his stern gaze sweeping across the assembled teachers. His pressed suit and perfectly knotted tie exuded an air of authority that demanded attention. The room fell silent as he cleared his throat. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice crisp and commanding. "I've called this meeting to address a matter of utmost importance, the maintenance of order and discipline in our school." A few teachers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Ms. Rodriguez, a young English teacher, glanced nervously at her colleague, Mr. Thompson. Principal Jenkins continued, his tone unwavering. "We've seen a rise in disruptive behavior lately, and it's our duty to nip it in the bud. We must be firm and consistent in our approach to discipline." He paced slowly across the front of the room, hands clasped behind his back. "Remember, a well-behaved student body is the foundation of academic excellence. We cannot allow a few troublemakers to derail the progress of the many." As he spoke, a palpable tension filled the air. Some teachers nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uneasy glances. "I expect each of you to report any infractions immediately," Jenkins emphasized, his eyes narrowing. "No matter how small. We must send a clear message that misbehavior will not be tolerated." Ms. Rodriguez raised her hand tentatively. "Principal Jenkins, I was wondering if we could discuss alternative approaches to discipline, perhaps focusing more on understanding the root causes of—" Jenkins cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Ms. Rodriguez, I appreciate your concern, but we've tried understanding approaches. They simply don't work. Firm consequences are the only language some students understand." The young teacher's face fell and she sank back in her chair. Mr. Thompson patted her shoulder sympathetically. As the meeting continued, Jenkins outlined his plans for stricter hall monitoring and a zero-tolerance policy for tardiness. With each new rule, the discomfort among some staff members grew more evident. Near the end of the meeting, Mr. Daniels, a veteran history teacher, spoke up. "Sir, I couldn't help but notice that many of the students facing disciplinary action lately have been from minority backgrounds. Is there a reason for this trend?" A tense silence fell over the room. Principal Jenkins's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with barely contained anger. "Mr. Daniels," he said, his voice dangerously low, "I suggest you choose your words very carefully. Are you implying that our disciplinary measures are biased?" Mr. Daniels held his ground. "I'm simply pointing out an observation, sir. Perhaps we should examine our practices to ensure fairness for all students." Jenkins' face reddened. "Our practices are fair and just. If certain students find themselves in trouble more often, that's on them, not us. This meeting is adjourned." As the teachers filed out, whispered conversations broke out. Some defended Jenkins's approach, while others expressed concern about the direction the school was taking. Principal Jenkins remained at the front of the room, his posture rigid and unyielding. He watched the teachers leave, convinced that his methods were right and necessary. Little did he know that his actions were sowing the seeds of a conflict that would soon challenge everything he thought he knew about discipline, fairness, and the true meaning of education. The morning sun peeked through the classroom windows, casting a warm glow on the eager faces of Mrs. Williams' fifth-grade class. Among them sat Alana Carter, her dark eyes shining with anticipation. The 10-year-old girl sat up straight, her hands neatly folded on her desk, ready to tackle the day's lessons. Mrs. Williams smiled as she walked between the rows of desks, handing out review sheets for the upcoming exam. "Remember, class," she said in her gentle voice, "this test is important, but it doesn't define who you are. Just do your best." When she reached Alana's desk, Mrs. Williams paused. "Alana, you've been working so hard. I know you'll do great." Alana's face lit up with a mix of joy and nervousness. "Thank you, Mrs. Williams," she said softly. "I really want to do well." As the other students chattered excitedly, Alana carefully tucked the review sheet into her folder. She loved learning, and the thought of the big test made her stomach flutter with excitement and worry. During lunch break, while her classmates played outside, Alana found a quiet corner in the library. She spread out her notes and textbooks, determined to go over everything one more time. Her friend Jessie spotted her and walked over. "Alana, aren't you coming to play?" Alana looked up, torn between her studies and the temptation of fun. "I just want to review a little more," she explained. "This test is really important." Jessie nodded understandingly. "You're so smart, Alana. You'll ace it for sure." As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Alana carefully packed her backpack. Mrs. Williams approached her desk with a kind smile. "Alana, I saw you studying during lunch," she said. "Your dedication is admirable, but remember to take breaks too. A fresh mind is just as important as a prepared one." Alana nodded, her eyes wide with respect for her teacher. "I will, Mrs. Williams. I just want to make sure I'm ready." Mrs. Williams placed a gentle hand on Alana's shoulder. "You've always been an excellent student, Alana. Your love for learning shines through in everything you do. Just believe in yourself, okay?" Alana's chest swelled with pride at her teacher's words. She felt a surge of confidence, mixed with a determination to prove herself worthy of Mrs. Williams's faith in her. As she walked home, Alana's mind raced with formulas, facts, and figures. The big test was tomorrow, and she was both excited and nervous. But deep down, she knew she had worked hard and was ready to show what she could do. The next week, a buzz of excitement filled the air as Mrs. Williams prepared to announce the exam results. Alana sat at her desk, her heart pounding with anticipation. She had given it her all, but would it be enough? Mrs. Williams beamed at the class. "I'm so proud of all of you," she said warmly. "You've worked incredibly hard, and it shows in your results." As she began reading out the scores, Alana held her breath. When Mrs. Williams reached her name, she paused for a moment, her smile growing wider. "Alana Carter," she announced, "you've achieved the highest score in the class. Congratulations." The room erupted in applause. Alana's eyes widened in disbelief, then filled with tears of joy. Her classmates patted her on the back, offering words of praise and congratulations. Later that day, during a school assembly, Principal Howard Jenkins stood at the podium, his stern gaze sweeping over the sea of young faces before him. As he listened to the teachers' reports on recent academic achievements, his brow furrowed at the mention of Alana's top score. "And in Mrs. Williams's 5th grade class," the teacher was saying, "Alana Carter achieved the highest score on the recent exam." Principal Howard's eyes narrowed as he spotted Alana in the crowd. She sat tall and proud, a shy smile on her face as her classmates whispered their congratulations. "Impossible," he muttered under his breath. His mind raced with doubt and suspicion. How could someone like her outperform all the other students? As the assembly concluded, Principal Howard made his way through the dispersing crowd. He approached Mrs. Williams, his voice low and stern. "I'd like to see Alana Carter in my office immediately." Mrs. Williams looked surprised. "Is everything all right, Principal Jenkins?" He nodded curtly. "Just a routine check. Please send her over right away." Alana's heart sank as she watched Principal Howard speaking to Mrs. Williams. She could tell by their expressions that something was wrong. When Mrs. Williams approached her with a concerned look, Alana's stomach twisted with worry. "Alana, dear," Mrs. Williams said gently, "Principal Jenkins would like to see you in his office." Alana's voice trembled as she asked, "Did I do something wrong, Mrs. Williams?" Mrs. Williams squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. "I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. Just be honest and respectful, okay?" With shaky legs, Alana made her way to the principal's office. As she stood outside the imposing door, she took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. She couldn't understand why she was being called in. Hadn't she done well? Wasn't that what they always wanted? Gathering her courage, Alana knocked softly on the door. "Come in," Principal Howard's stern voice called from inside. Alana stepped into Principal Howard's office, her heart racing. The room felt cold and unwelcoming, with its stark white walls and imposing wooden desk. Principal Howard sat behind it, his face set in a stern expression. "Sit down, Alana," he said, his voice sharp. Alana lowered herself into the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Principal Howard leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I've called you here to discuss your recent exam results," he began. "Your score was unusually high." Alana's eyes widened. "I studied really hard, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you now?" Principal Howard's tone was skeptical. "Or perhaps you found another way to achieve such an unbelievable score." Alana felt her cheeks grow hot. I don't understand, sir. What do you mean?" "I mean, Alana," he said, his voice growing colder, "that I believe you cheated on the exam." The accusation hit Alana like a physical blow. Tears sprang to her eyes. "But I didn't cheat," she protested. "I would never do that." Principal Howard shook his head. "It's simply not believable that someone like you could outperform all the other students without some form of assistance." Alana's mind reeled. Someone like her? What did that mean? She opened her mouth to speak, but Principal Howard cut her off. "I've made my decision," he said firmly. "To set an example and deter other students from similar behavior, you will be expelled from this school." Alana felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her. Expelled? But she hadn't done anything wrong. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to find words to defend herself. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Williams entered, her face etched with concern. "Principal Jenkins, is everything all right?" Principal Howard's expression hardened. "Mrs. Williams, this doesn't concern you. I've made my decision regarding Alana's cheating." Mrs. Williams gasped. "Cheating? But that's impossible. Alana is one of our brightest students. She's always been honest and hardworking." "I appreciate your input, Mrs. Williams," Principal Howard said dismissively, "but my decision is final. Alana will be expelled." Mrs. Williams tried to argue further, but Principal Howard held up his hand, silencing her. "That's enough. Please escort Alana out and inform her parents of the situation." Alana sat frozen in her chair, devastation washing over her. She had worked so hard, dreamed so big, and now it was all crumbling around her. As Mrs. Williams gently helped her to her feet, Alana felt a piece of her heart break. Alana stumbled out of the school building, her vision blurred by tears. The bright sunlight felt harsh and unforgiving as she made her way down the front steps. Her backpack felt heavier than ever, weighed down by the unfairness of what had just happened. As she reached the bottom of the steps, a familiar voice called out to her. "Alana? Sweetie, what's wrong?" Alana looked up to see her mother, Mrs. Carter, rushing towards her. The sight of her mom's concerned face broke the last of Alana's composure, and she burst into loud sobs. Mrs. Carter wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her tight. "Shh, it's okay. Tell me what happened," she soothed, stroking Alana's hair. Between hiccups and sobs, Alana managed to explain. "Principal Howard. He said I cheated on the exam. But I didn't, Mom. I swear I didn't." Mrs. Carter's body stiffened. Her eyes flashed with anger as she looked up at the school building. "He said what?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. He expelled me," Alana whispered, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Mrs. Carter took a deep breath, trying to control her anger. She gently wiped Alana's tears away with her thumb. "You stay right here, sweetie. I'm going to have a talk with Principal Howard." With determination in her step, Mrs. Carter marched into the school, her heels clicking loudly on the polished floor. She burst into Howard's office without knocking, her eyes blazing. "Mr. Jenkins," she said, her voice tight with controlled fury, "I demand an explanation. How dare you accuse my daughter of cheating?" Howard looked up, startled by the sudden intrusion. He quickly composed himself, his face settling into a mask of authority. "Mrs. Carter, I understand you're upset, but I assure you my decision was not made lightly," "Where's your proof?" Mrs. Carter demanded, placing her hands on his desk and leaning forward. "You can't just expel a student without evidence." Howard cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "There were irregularities in the exam results. Alana's score was far above what we would expect from her." "Expected from her?" Mrs. Carter's voice rose. "And what exactly do you mean by that? My daughter has always been an excellent student. She worked hard for that score." "Mrs. Carter, please understand," Howard began, but Mrs. Carter cut him off. "No, you understand this, Mr. Jenkins," she said, her voice low and intense. "You have made a big mistake. This isn't over. I will not stand by and watch you destroy my daughter's future based on your unfounded suspicions and prejudices." Howard's face flushed red, but before he could respond, Mrs. Carter turned on her heel and strode out of the office. As she left, she called over her shoulder, "Expect to hear from our lawyer. We're not done here." Mrs. Carter stormed out of the school, her heart pounding with anger and determination. She found Alana sitting on a bench, looking small and defeated. Kneeling in front of her daughter, Mrs. Carter cupped Alana's face in her hands. "Listen to me, sweetie," she said softly. "We're going to fix this. What Principal Howard did was wrong, and we're not going to let him get away with it." Alana nodded, a glimmer of hope shining through her tears. Mrs. Carter helped her up, and they walked to the car together. As they drove home, Mrs. Carter's mind raced with plans. She knew exactly who to call. The moment they got home, Mrs. Carter picked up the phone and dialed her husband's office number. Mr. Carter, a respected civil rights attorney, answered on the second ring. "David," Mrs. Carter said, her voice tight with emotion, "we need your help. It's about Alana." She quickly explained the situation, her words tumbling out in a rush of frustration and worry. On the other end of the line, Mr. Carter listened intently, his frown deepening with each detail. "This isn't the first time I've heard complaints about Howard's disciplinary practices," Mr. Carter said when his wife finished. "I've been gathering information for months. This might be the case. We need to bring it all to light." Mrs. Carter felt a surge of hope. "What can we do?" "I'm going to file a formal complaint with the school board," Mr. Carter replied, determination evident in his voice. "We'll demand a full investigation into Howard's practices, focusing on racial bias in his disciplinary actions." Over the next few days, Mr. Carter worked tirelessly, compiling evidence and preparing the complaint. He reached out to other families who had similar experiences with Howard, building a strong case that showed a pattern of discriminatory behavior. When the complaint was finally filed, it sent shockwaves through the school district. The school board, faced with such serious allegations, had no choice but to launch a full investigation into Howard's conduct. As news of the complaint spread, more families came forward with their own stories. Teachers who had long been uncomfortable with Howard's methods began to speak up, providing crucial testimony about his biased treatment of minority students. 5 minutes after Alana left his office, Principal Howard Jenkins leaned back in his chair, a smug smile playing on his lips. He felt satisfied with his decision, convinced he had maintained order in his school. The ringing of his phone startled him out of his self-congratulatory reverie. "Jenkins speaking," he answered, his voice crisp and authoritative. "Howard, this is Superintendent Santos," came the stern voice on the other end. Howard's smile faded as he detected the tension in the superintendent's tone. "We have a serious situation on our hands," Santos continued. "A formal complaint has been filed against you with the school board. It alleges racial bias in your disciplinary practices, with specific mention of your recent expulsion of Alana Carter." Howard's mouth went dry. He gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles turning white. "What? That's absurd. I was simply upholding the school's standards." "The allegations are serious enough that the board has decided to launch an immediate investigation into the school's disciplinary policies," Santos explained, his voice grave. "They'll be looking into all your past decisions, Howard. This could have severe repercussions." As the superintendent's words sank in, Howard felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. His mind raced, recalling all the disciplinary actions he had taken over the years. Had he really been unfair? No, he told himself. He had always done what was best for the school. "This is ridiculous," Howard sputtered, trying to regain his composure. "I've always acted in the best interest of the school and its students." "That may be," Santos replied, "but the evidence presented is compelling. The board will be thorough in their investigation. I suggest you prepare yourself, Howard. This could seriously impact your reputation and career." As the call ended, Howard slumped in his chair, the weight of the situation crushing down on him. For the first time in years, he felt truly rattled. The carefully constructed image he had built of himself as a fair and just administrator began to crumble. He glanced at the framed awards on his office wall, accolades for his years of service in education. Would they mean anything if these allegations proved true? Howard's hands trembled as he reached for his desk drawer, pulling out his personal files. He needed to review every disciplinary action he had taken to prove to himself and to the board that he had always acted fairly. But as he flipped through the pages, a sinking feeling grew in the pit of his stomach. The faces of the students he had disciplined over the years flashed before his eyes, and he couldn't help but notice a pattern he had never acknowledged before. The news of Alana's expulsion spread through the community like wildfire. By the next morning, local news vans were parked outside Westbrook Elementary School, their cameras trained on the building's brick facade. Headlines flashed across TV screens and newspapers. "Top student expelled. Racial bias alleged at local school." Inside the school, tension hung thick in the air. Teachers huddled in small groups, whispering their concerns and sharing stories they had long kept to themselves. Mrs. Williams, her eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night, approached a cluster of her colleagues. "I can't believe it took this long for someone to speak up," she said, her voice trembling. "I've seen Howard target minority students for years, but I was always too afraid to say anything." Other teachers nodded in agreement. Mr. Thompson, a veteran math teacher, sighed heavily. "Remember when he suspended Jamal last year for disruptive behavior? The poor kid was just asking for help with a problem." As the day wore on, parents began calling the school, demanding answers. Some even showed up in person, their faces etched with worry and anger. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose son had been unfairly disciplined last semester, stood at the front desk, her voice rising with each word. "This has gone on long enough," she exclaimed. "My Carlos was punished for speaking Spanish in the hallway. How is that fair?" Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Community members held signs reading, "Justice for Alana," and "End racial bias in our schools." Local news reporters interviewed parents and former students, each sharing their own experiences with Howard's disciplinary actions. Alana's parents stood at the center of it all, their faces a mix of determination and exhaustion. Mr. Carter, his lawyer's briefcase in hand, addressed the crowd. "We're not just fighting for Alana," he said, his voice strong and clear. "We're fighting for every child who has been unfairly targeted, every student who has been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin." The crowd cheered, their voices rising in support. As the investigation began, a sense of hope mingled with the tension. For the first time in years, people felt that real change might be possible at Westbrook Elementary. Howard sat at his kitchen table, staring blankly at the letter from the school board. The words, "administrative leave," seemed to mock him from the crisp white paper. He crumpled the letter in his fist, his face flushing with anger and disbelief. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to himself. "I've done nothing wrong. I was just doing my job." The sudden silence of his home felt oppressive. No ringing phones, no bustling hallways, no daily routines to manage. Howard paced back and forth, his mind racing with thoughts of betrayal. He remembered the faces of his staff members, how they had looked away when he was escorted out of the building. The memory stung like a fresh wound. "After all I've done for that school," he grumbled. "Years of maintaining order and discipline, and this is how they repay me?" Howard's denial ran deep. In his mind, he replayed the incident with Alana over and over again. Each time, he convinced himself that he had made the right call. "The rules are there for a reason," he said aloud, as if trying to reassure himself. "If I let one student get away with cheating, where would it end?" But a small voice in the back of his mind whispered doubts. Had he really had any evidence of cheating? Why had he been so quick to assume the worst? Howard shook his head, pushing the thoughts away. He couldn't afford to question himself now. He was the victim here, not Alana or any of the other students he had disciplined over the years. As the days passed, Howard found himself glued to the local news, watching as the story unfolded. Each new report seemed to paint him in a worse light. Former students came forward with their own stories of unfair treatment. Parents shared their frustrations and concerns. "They don't understand," Howard muttered, switching off the TV in disgust. "Without strict discipline, the whole system falls apart. I was protecting the integrity of the school." But as much as he tried to justify his actions, Howard couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. The certainty he had always felt in his decisions began to waver, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. Still, he clung to his convictions, refusing to acknowledge any wrongdoing. In his mind, he was the last bastion of order in a world gone mad with political correctness. He was sure that once the investigation was over, everyone would see that he had been right all along. Next day, Mrs. Carter stood at the front of the crowded community center, her eyes scanning the sea of concerned faces before her. She took a deep breath, gathering her strength for the important task ahead. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her voice steady and determined. "We're here to share our experiences and shed light on the unfair disciplinary practices at our school." The room fell silent as Mrs. Carter opened the floor for others to speak. One by one, parents stood up, their voices trembling with emotion as they recounted their children's experiences. A mother with tears in her eyes spoke about her son. "My boy, he's only 8. He got detention for talking in class while his white classmate just got a warning for the same thing. It's not right." Nods of agreement rippled through the crowd. Another parent, a father with a deep frown, shared his story. "My daughter was suspended for a week for wearing her hair in braids. They said it was distracting. But the white girls with colorful hair extensions? Not a word to them." As more parents spoke up, a pattern emerged. Black students faced harsher punishments for minor infractions, while their white peers often received lighter consequences, or no punishment at all. Mrs. Carter's heart ached for these families, but she felt a spark of hope growing. They weren't alone anymore. They had found their voices. Finally, it was Alana's turn to speak. The young girl stood up slowly, her eyes downcast. Mrs. Carter gave her an encouraging nod, and Alana took a shaky breath. "I always loved school," Alana began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I worked so hard to get good grades. But when I got the highest score on that test, Principal Howard said I must have cheated. He didn't even listen to me." Alana's voice grew stronger as she continued. "Being expelled made me feel like I wasn't smart enough, like I didn't belong. I started to think maybe I really wasn't good enough." Tears welled up in Alana's eyes, and Mrs. Carter felt her own eyes stinging. The room was silent, every person hanging on Alana's words. "But now I know that's not true," Alana said, lifting her chin. "I am smart. I do belong. And what happened to me wasn't fair." A wave of applause swept through the room. Parents and students alike stood up, showing their support for Alana and all the other children who had faced similar injustices. Mrs. Carter wrapped her arm around Alana's shoulders, her heart swelling with pride. The meeting had done more than just gather stories. It had brought their community together, united in their determination to fight for change. As the investigation into Principal Howard Jenkins' disciplinary practices deepened, the school board's inquiry team found themselves inundated with a growing mountain of evidence. What had started as a single complaint from the Carters had snowballed into a full-blown exposé of years of biased decision-making. In a small, stuffy conference room at the district office, lead investigator Melinda Pearson sifted through stacks of documents. Her eyes widened as she uncovered yet another troubling incident. "This can't be coincidence," she muttered, shaking her head. The door creaked open and a nervous-looking teacher poked her head in. "Ms. Pearson, I'm here to give my statement." Melinda looked up, offering a reassuring smile. "Please come in, Ms. Rodriguez. Your cooperation is greatly appreciated." As Ms. Rodriguez settled into a chair, Melinda could see the tension in her shoulders. "I know this isn't easy," Melinda said gently, "but your testimony could make a real difference." Ms. Rodriguez nodded, took a deep breath, and began to speak. She recounted multiple instances where Howard had dismissed her concerns about unfair treatment of minority students. Her voice grew stronger as she shared specific examples, dates, and details that corroborated other accounts. Meanwhile, across town, Mrs. Williams sat in her living room, surrounded by years' worth of class records and notes. She had spent days combing through her files, piecing together a clear pattern of Howard's biased actions. Her hands trembled slightly as she dialed the number for the investigation team. "Hello? This is Elena Williams. I have some information about Principal Jenkins that I think you need to see." Back at the district office, Melinda's team worked tirelessly, cross-referencing testimonies and documents. The evidence was overwhelming. Howard's disciplinary actions showed a clear bias against minority students, with harsher punishments consistently doled out for similar infractions. As the day wore on, more teachers came forward. Some shared tearful apologies for not speaking up sooner, while others expressed relief at finally being heard. Each account added another piece to the puzzle, painting a damning picture of Howard's leadership. Mrs. Williams's testimony proved to be the keystone. Her meticulous records, coupled with her first-hand account of Alana's unfair expulsion, provided the concrete evidence the investigation needed. Her voice shook as she recounted her failed attempt to defend Alana, but her resolve was clear. "I should have done more," Mrs. Williams said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But I'm doing it now. These children deserve better." Meanwhile, Howard Jenkins paced back and forth in his living room, his usually crisp shirt now wrinkled and his tie askew. The weight of the investigation bore down on him, crushing his once unshakable confidence. He glanced at the clock, noting it was nearly time for his emergency appeal to the school board. With trembling hands, he dialed into the conference call. The faces of the board members appeared on his computer screen, their expressions stern and unyielding. "Mr. Jenkins," the board president began, her voice cool and professional, "we understand you wish to address the ongoing investigation." Howard cleared his throat, desperately trying to summon his usual authoritative tone. "Yes, thank you. I believe this investigation is unnecessary and damaging to our school's reputation. I've always acted in the best interest of maintaining order and discipline." He paused, expecting murmurs of agreement. Instead, he was met with stony silence. "I respectfully request that you reconsider this course of action," Howard continued, his voice wavering slightly. "Surely we can resolve this matter internally without all this publicity." The board president's expression remained unchanged. "Mr. Jenkins, we appreciate your concern. However, the board has unanimously decided to proceed with the investigation until all facts are uncovered. The allegations are too serious to ignore." Howard felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. But my record speaks for itself. I've dedicated years to this school." "Your past service is noted," another board member interjected, "but it doesn't exempt you from scrutiny. We have a responsibility to ensure fair treatment for all students." As the call continued, Howard's protests grew weaker. The board's resolve was clear. They would not be swayed. With each passing moment, the reality of his situation sank in. When the call ended, Howard slumped into his chair, his head in his hands. For the first time, he truly grasped the gravity of what was happening. His career, his reputation, everything he had built over decades, was hanging by a thread. How did it come to this? He whispered to himself, the weight of his actions finally beginning to settle on his shoulders. As the investigation into Howard Jenkins's disciplinary practices continued, the school board decided to conduct a thorough audit of the school's finances. It was standard procedure during such investigations, but no one expected what they would uncover. On a chilly Tuesday morning, the lead auditor, Mrs. Patel, sat at her makeshift desk in the school's conference room. She frowned as she pored over the financial records, her keen eyes catching discrepancies that others might have missed. "This doesn't add up," she muttered, tapping her pen against the desk. Just then, her assistant burst into the room, waving a piece of paper. "Mrs. Patel, you need to see this. We just got an anonymous tip." Mrs. Patel's eyes widened as she read the note. It pointed to a series of suspicious transactions linked to Howard's past projects. With renewed vigor, She dove back into the financial records, following the trail of breadcrumbs left by the tipster. As the day wore on, a disturbing pattern emerged. Howard had been funneling school funds into personal accounts, disguising them as expenses for various school projects. The amounts were significant, totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years. Mrs. Patel called an emergency meeting with the school board. The room was tense as she presented her findings. "I'm afraid it's worse than we thought," she began, her voice grave. "We've uncovered evidence of financial misconduct spanning several years." The board members exchanged worried glances as Mrs. Patel laid out the details. The scandal that had started with accusations of racial bias and disciplinary actions had now ballooned into something much larger. Meanwhile, Howard sat at home unaware of the new developments. He was startled by a sharp knock at the door. Opening it, he found two stern-faced detectives on his doorstep. "Mr. Jenkins," one of them said, "we need you to come with us. There are some questions we need to ask about the school's finances." Howard's face paled. He felt the ground shift beneath his feet as he realized his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. The investigation had taken an unexpected turn, and he was now facing not just professional disgrace but potential criminal charges. As the detectives led him to their car, Howard caught sight of his neighbors watching from their windows. The shame and fear he felt were overwhelming. He had never imagined that his actions would lead to this moment. As the financial investigation expanded, the auditors worked tirelessly, digging deeper into the school's financial records. Mrs. Patel and her team spent long hours poring over documents, following paper trails and uncovering a web of deceit that seemed to grow more tangled with each passing day. The community, already reeling from the accusations of racial bias, was stunned by the new revelations. News of misappropriated funds and irregularities in budget allocations spread like wildfire through the town. Parents who had previously remained on the sidelines now found themselves drawn into the fray, their indifference turning to outrage. At a hastily organized PTA meeting, the atmosphere was electric. The school gymnasium was packed, with concerned parents filling every available seat and lining the walls. Mrs. Carter stood at the podium, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "We came here seeking justice for our children," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "But what we've uncovered goes beyond discrimination. It's a betrayal of our trust." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the audience. A father in the back row stood up, his face red with anger. "How could this happen right under our noses?" he demanded. Mrs. Williams, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, stepped forward. "We trusted Howard," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "We all did, but now we see that trust was misplaced." As the meeting progressed, more parents joined the call for Howard's resignation. The issue was no longer just about Alana or the other minority students who had faced unfair treatment. It had become a matter of integrity and trust in the entire school system. Outside the gymnasium, local news crews gathered, their cameras trained on the school entrance. The story had grown beyond a local scandal, attracting attention from larger media outlets. Reporters jostled for position, eager to capture the next development in what was quickly becoming a sensational story of corruption in small-town America. Back at the Board of Education office, the superintendent sat at his desk, his head in his hands. The phone hadn't stopped ringing all day, with angry parents demanding answers and action. He knew that the situation had spiraled far beyond what anyone had initially anticipated. "We need to make a statement," his assistant said, peering around the door. "The press is camped out front." The superintendent nodded wearily. He stood up, straightening his tie and taking a deep breath. As he walked towards the press conference, he knew that the coming days would be crucial. The community's trust had been shaken to its core, and rebuilding it would be no easy task. As Alana's story continued to gain attention, her quiet strength and unwavering determination caught the eye of local community leaders. They saw in her a spark that could ignite change, and soon, Alana found herself invited to speak at community forums. At first, the idea of speaking in front of crowds terrified her. She was just a 10-year-old girl who loved learning, not a public speaker. But with her parents' encouragement and Mrs. Williams's gentle coaching, Alana found her voice. Her first speech was at the local community center. As she stepped up to the microphone, her hands shaking slightly, she looked out at the sea of faces. Some were familiar: classmates, teachers, neighbors. Others were strangers drawn by her story. Alana took a deep breath and began to speak. "I never wanted to be in the spotlight," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I just wanted to learn and do my best. But when I was accused of cheating and expelled, I realized that sometimes you have to stand up for what's right even when it's scary." Her words touched hearts and opened eyes. People listened, really listened to this young girl who spoke with such honesty and courage. As Alana shared her experiences, others in the audience began to nod, recognizing similar struggles in their own lives or the lives of their children. Alana's resilience became an inspiration to others. Her story sparked a movement for fair treatment in schools, not just for her, but for all students who had faced discrimination or unfair treatment. Local activists, energized by Alana's courage, began organizing demonstrations outside the school. They carried signs demanding justice and policy changes. "Fair treatment for all students," read one. "Education is a right, not a privilege," proclaimed another. The demonstrations grew larger each day. Parents, students, and concerned community members joined together, their voices rising in a unified call for change. The once quiet street in front of the school became a sea of colorful signs and determined faces. Alana, watching from the sidelines with her parents, felt a mix of emotions. She was proud to see so many people standing up for what was right, but she also felt a twinge of sadness. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something much bigger. As the movement gained momentum, Alana continued to speak at forums and rallies. Each time she spoke, her confidence grew. She shared her story, but she also listened to others, learning about their experiences and struggles. "We're not just fighting for me," Alana told a crowd at a local park. "We're fighting for every student who's ever felt scared or alone. We're fighting for a future where every child can learn and grow without fear." Her words resonated with people of all ages and backgrounds. Alana's story had become a rallying cry for change, a symbol of hope in the face of injustice. The movement she inspired continued to grow, spreading beyond the boundaries of their small town and catching the attention of regional and even national media. The school board convened in a somber atmosphere, the weight of their decision heavy in the air. The large conference room was filled to capacity, with board members, investigators, and legal counsel all present for this crucial meeting. As the chairperson called the meeting to order, a hush fell over the room. The lead investigator stood up, a thick folder in hand, and began to present the findings of their extensive investigation into Principal Howard Jenkins's conduct. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," the investigator began, her voice steady and clear. "What we've uncovered is deeply troubling." She proceeded to lay out a damning case against Howard. Charts and graphs flashed on the screen behind her, showing clear patterns of discriminatory disciplinary actions. The numbers were stark and undeniable. Minority students, especially black students like Alana, had faced disproportionately harsh punishments for similar infractions compared to their peers. The board members listened intently, their faces growing more serious with each revelation. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others scribbled furious notes. Next came the financial discrepancies. The investigator pulled up spreadsheets showing suspicious transactions and irregularities in budget allocations. "We've found evidence of misappropriated funds dating back several years," she explained, pointing out specific examples. As the presentation concluded, a heavy silence fell over the room. The chairperson thanked the investigator and then turned to address the board. "We've heard the evidence," she said, her voice grave. "Now we must decide how to move forward." The discussion that followed was intense. Board members debated the implications of the findings, the impact on the school and community, and their responsibility to the students. One board member, his voice filled with emotion, spoke up. "We can't ignore this. We have a duty to protect our students and ensure fair treatment for all." Another nodded in agreement. "The financial mismanagement alone is grounds for termination. But coupled with the discriminatory practices, we have no choice." As the debate continued, it became clear that the majority of the board was leaning towards a decisive action. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the chairperson called for a vote. All those in favor of terminating Principal Howard Jenkins' position, effective immediately, please raise your hand. One by one, hands went up around the table. The vote was nearly unanimous. The chairperson nodded solemnly. The motion passes. Principal Jenkins' employment with our school district is hereby terminated. With that decision, the board had paved the way for significant changes in the school's leadership and policies. They knew there would be challenges ahead, but they were committed to creating a fairer, more inclusive environment for all students. The school board called a press conference to announce their decision. Reporters and community members packed the school auditorium, cameras flashing and microphones at the ready. The board chairperson stepped up to the podium, her face serious but determined. After a thorough investigation into the conduct of Principal Howard Jenkins, the board has unanimously decided for his termination effective immediately, she announced. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by murmurs of relief and satisfaction. Parents who had long voiced concerns about Howard's leadership nodded in approval, while teachers exchanged meaningful glances. As the news spread, reactions poured in from all corners of the community. Many expressed relief that Howard would no longer be in a position to influence their children's education. "It's about time," said one parent, wiping away tears of joy. "Our kids deserve better than what he gave them." But for many, Howard's resignation wasn't enough. A group of parents, led by Mrs. Carter, gathered outside the school, holding signs demanding further action. "Termination isn't justice," Mrs. Carter declared to a group of reporters. "We want to see legal consequences for the harm he's caused our children." The calls for legal action grew louder as more details of the investigation came to light. Community activists organized rallies, pushing for a broader examination of systemic issues within the school district. Meanwhile, Howard sat alone in his living room watching the news coverage of his downfall. The weight of his actions finally sank in as he saw his face plastered across the screen, accompanied by damning headlines. His phone rang incessantly with calls from former colleagues and friends, but Howard couldn't bring himself to answer. He felt a crushing sense of isolation as he realized how quickly his support network had crumbled. Looking around his home, Howard's eyes fell on the plaques and awards that once filled him with pride. Now, they seemed to mock him, reminders of a career built on biased practices and questionable decisions. As the days passed, Howard struggled to come to terms with his new reality. Job applications went unanswered, and invitations to community events dried up. He found himself avoiding public places, fearing the judgmental stares and whispered comments. As the dust settled from Howard's resignation, the legal storm began to brew. The district attorney's office announced they were launching a formal investigation into the financial discrepancies uncovered during the school board's inquiry. Howard's world, already shattered, began to crumble even further. One crisp morning, a knock at the door jolted Howard from his miserable reverie. Two stern-faced detectives stood on his porch, badges glinting in the sunlight. "Mr. Jenkins," one of them said, his voice firm but not unkind, "we need you to come with us for questioning regarding the financial irregularities at your former school." Howard's heart sank. He nodded numbly, following them to their waiting car. As they drove to the station, he stared out the window, barely recognizing the neighborhood he'd called home for so long. At the station, Howard sat in a cold, sterile interrogation room. The detectives laid out document after document, each one a damning piece of evidence against him. Bank statements, purchase orders, and budget reports all pointed to years of financial mismanagement under his watch. "Mr. Jenkins, can you explain these discrepancies?" one detective asked, his tone measured but accusatory. Howard's mouth went dry. He struggled to find words to explain away the mounting evidence. But deep down, he knew there was no escape from the truth. As the questioning dragged on, Howard's despair deepened. He realized that this was just the beginning. Criminal charges loomed on the horizon, threatening to strip away what little remained of his life. But the legal troubles didn't end there. Within days, Howard was served with multiple lawsuits. Parents, teachers, and even former students came forward, seeking justice for years of discriminatory practices and misused funds. Each new legal document that arrived felt like another nail in Howard's coffin. He spent sleepless nights poring over the papers, his mind reeling with the potential consequences. Fines, restitution, even jail time. The possibilities haunted his every waking moment. One afternoon, as Howard sat in his living room surrounded by legal papers, the full weight of his situation crashed down upon him. He buried his face in his hands, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. The man who once ruled his school with an iron fist now felt utterly powerless, facing a future filled with courtrooms and potential incarceration. Mrs. Carter stood at the podium, her voice ringing clear and strong through the packed auditorium. The community meeting she had organized was drawing to a close, but the energy in the room was only growing stronger. "We've seen what happens when bias and discrimination go unchecked," she said, her eyes scanning the crowd. "But now, we have a chance to make real change. We can't let this moment slip away." The audience nodded in agreement, many still reeling from the revelations about Howard's misconduct. Mrs. Carter continued, her passion evident in every word. "We need new policies that protect all our children. We need transparency, accountability, and a commitment to fairness from the top down." As she spoke, other community leaders stood up, voicing their support. Parents, teachers, and local activists all chimed in with ideas for reform. The room buzzed with determination and hope. Sitting in the front row, Alana listened intently. Her mother's words filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since the ordeal began. When Mrs. Carter finished speaking, she turned to Alana with a warm smile. "Alana, honey, would you like to say something?" Alana hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She walked up to the podium, her heart pounding. As she faced the crowd, she took a deep breath and began to speak. "What happened to me was wrong," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "But I don't want it to happen to anyone else. We can make things better if we work together." The audience listened in rapt attention as Alana shared her story. She spoke about the pain of being accused, the fear of losing her future, and the strength she found in standing up for herself. "We need to make sure every student feels safe and respected," Alana concluded, her voice growing stronger. "We can create a school where everyone has a fair chance to succeed." As Alana stepped down from the podium, the room erupted in applause. People stood up, cheering and wiping away tears. Mrs. Carter wrapped her daughter in a tight hug, pride shining in her eyes. In the days that followed, Alana's words became a rallying cry for change. Mrs. Carter and other community leaders worked tirelessly, drafting proposals for new policies and procedures. They called for regular audits of disciplinary actions, mandatory bias training for all staff, and the creation of a diverse student-parent advisory board. Alana, inspired by the movement she had helped spark, started a student group dedicated to promoting equality and understanding in the school. She organized study groups where students from different backgrounds could come together, share their experiences, and support each other academically. As the push for reform gained momentum, the school board took notice. They scheduled a series of public hearings to discuss the proposed changes, inviting community members to share their thoughts and experiences. The school board meeting was packed to capacity, with community members spilling out into the hallway. As the board members took their seats, a hush fell over the room. The chairperson, Mrs. Thompson, cleared her throat and began to speak. "After careful consideration of the community's concerns and the recent events that have come to light, we have decided to implement significant changes to our school policies," she announced. A murmur of anticipation rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Carter squeezed Alana's hand, both of them holding their breath. "First and foremost," Mrs. Thompson continued, "we will be introducing restorative justice programs in all our schools. These programs will focus on repairing harm and rebuilding relationships rather than solely punitive measures." The announcement was met with nods of approval and scattered applause. Mrs. Thompson went on to outline the details of the new program, explaining how it would give students a voice in resolving conflicts and addressing behavioral issues. "Additionally," she said, her voice firm, We will be implementing mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all faculty and staff. This training will be ongoing and comprehensive, designed to address unconscious biases and promote a more inclusive school environment. At this, the room erupted in cheers. Parents and teachers alike stood up, clapping and hugging one another. Alana felt a surge of pride and hope, realizing that her experience had helped bring about these much-needed changes. Mrs. Thompson raised her hand for silence. We want to acknowledge that these reforms were largely inspired by recent events, particularly the unjust treatment of one of our students, Alana Carter. All eyes turned to Alana, who blushed but sat up straighter, meeting the gaze of the board members with quiet confidence. Alana's courage in speaking out against injustice has been a catalyst for change, Mrs. Thompson continued. Her story has opened our eyes to the need for a more equitable and inclusive approach to education and discipline in our district. As the meeting concluded, people swarmed around Alana and her family, offering congratulations and thanks. Teachers approached with tears in their eyes, expressing relief and excitement about the new direction the school was taking. Mrs. Williams, Alana's former teacher, made her way through the crowd. "Alana," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "I'm so proud of you. You've done more than just clear your name. You've paved the way for a better future for all our students." Alana smiled, feeling a mix of joy and responsibility. She knew that these changes were just the beginning, but they marked a significant turning point in the district's approach to discipline and inclusivity. The day of Alana's return to school arrived, filled with anticipation and hope. As she approached the school gates, a crowd of students, parents, and teachers had gathered to welcome her back. Colorful banners waved in the air, bearing messages of support and celebration. Mrs. Thompson, the school board chairperson, stepped forward as Alana and her parents reached the entrance. She cleared her throat, her voice ringing out across the hushed crowd. "On behalf of the entire school board, I want to extend our sincerest apologies to Alana Carter and her family," Mrs. Thompson began. "We recognize the injustice that was done, and we are committed to ensuring it never happens again." Alana stood tall, her eyes glistening with unshed tears as Mrs. Thompson continued. "Alana, your strength and courage in the face of adversity have inspired us all. We are honored to welcome you back to our school community." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Alana's classmates surged forward, engulfing her in hugs and words of support. The moment was electric, a tangible feeling of change and progress in the air. As the initial excitement settled, Mr. Johnson, a representative from a local educational foundation, stepped forward. "Alana," he said, his voice warm and encouraging, "your resilience and determination have not gone unnoticed. Our foundation would like to award you a full scholarship for your future education, in recognition of your courage and the positive change you've inspired." Alana's eyes widened in surprise and gratitude. She looked at her parents, who were beaming with pride, tears streaming down their faces. The crowd once again burst into applause, celebrating this recognition of Alana's strength. As Alana made her way through the school halls, she was struck by how different everything felt. The atmosphere was lighter, more inclusive. She overheard snippets of conversation about the new restorative justice programs and diversity training. During lunch, Alana sat with her friends, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I want to do more to help make our school better for everyone." Her friend Sarah leaned in, curious. "What do you mean, Alana?" Alana's eyes lit up as she explained, "I was thinking we could start a student group. We could work on projects to improve our school community, maybe even mentor younger kids who might be struggling." The idea took hold quickly. By the end of the day, Alana had gathered a small group of enthusiastic students ready to turn her vision into reality. They decided to call their group Voices for Change, with the goal of fostering understanding and inclusivity throughout the school. In the weeks following her return, Alana's idea for a student group blossomed into reality. With the support of her parents and teachers, she officially launched the Voices for Change Study Group Club. The club's mission was clear: to promote equality, support academic success for all students, and create a safe space for sharing experiences. On the day of the first meeting, Alana stood nervously at the front of the classroom, watching as students from various backgrounds filed in. She took a deep breath and began, Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you're all here. This club is about more than just studying. It's about supporting each other and making our school a better place for everyone. The students listened intently as Alana explained the club's goals. She emphasized the importance of inclusivity and standing up against discrimination. As the meeting progressed, students began to open up, sharing their own experiences and challenges. Lily, a shy girl from Alana's class, raised her hand timidly. "I've always struggled with math," she admitted, "but I've been afraid to ask for help because I didn't want anyone to think I was, not smart enough." Alana smiled encouragingly. "That's exactly why we're here. We all have strengths and weaknesses. By supporting each other, we can all improve and succeed." As the weeks passed, the club grew in both size and impact. Students who had once felt isolated found a sense of belonging. Those who excelled in certain subjects eagerly helped others who were struggling. The club became a melting pot of ideas, experiences, and mutual support. Alana's leadership skills flourished as she guided the club. She organized study sessions, facilitated discussions on equality, and even arranged for guest speakers to talk about their experiences overcoming adversity. One afternoon, as the club meeting was wrapping up, Mrs. Carter stopped by to see how things were going. She watched with pride as Alana confidently led the group, fostering an atmosphere of respect and understanding. After the meeting, several parents approached Mrs. Carter. "We can't thank you enough," said Mr. Rodriguez, his eyes brimming with emotion. "You stood up not just for Alana, but for all of our children. Your bravery in speaking out has made such a difference." Mrs. Williams nodded in agreement. "You gave us the courage to share our own stories. Because of you, our children now have a voice and a place where they truly belong." Mrs. Carter was deeply moved by their words. "I only did what any parent would do," she said humbly. "But I'm so grateful that it's led to this positive change. Seeing these kids supporting each other, it's more than I could have ever hoped for." As they watched the students leave the classroom, chatting animatedly and making plans for their next study session, Mrs. Carter felt a sense of hope for the future. The Voices for Change Club was more than just a study group. It was a testament to the power of standing up for what's right and the positive change that can come from adversity. As the weeks passed, Alana's Voices for Change study group club continued to grow in popularity. Word spread quickly throughout the school, and more students began to show up at each meeting. The classroom they used was soon bursting at the seams with eager faces from all grades and backgrounds. Alana watched with a mix of pride and amazement as the club's influence began to ripple through the school. In the cafeteria, students who had once sat in segregated groups now mingled freely, sharing lunches and laughter. During class discussions, more voices chimed in, emboldened by the supportive atmosphere fostered in the club. One day, as Alana was setting up for a meeting, she overheard two teachers talking in the hallway. "Have you noticed the change in the students lately?" Mrs. Thompson asked. Mrs. Williams nodded, her eyes twinkling. "It's remarkable. There's a sense of unity I've never seen before. And it all started with Alana's club." Alana felt a warmth spread through her chest at these words. She hadn't realized just how much of an impact the club was having beyond its members. Meanwhile, across town, Howard Jenkins sat in his living room, a shadow of his former self. The ankle monitor on his leg served as a constant reminder of his house arrest during the ongoing investigation. The trial loomed ahead, casting a dark cloud over his days. As Howard flipped through the local newspaper, he came across an article about the positive changes at the school. His eyes widened as he read about the Voices for Change Club and its founder, Alana Carter, the very student he had wrongfully expelled. For the first time, Howard felt a twinge of something unfamiliar. It wasn't quite remorse yet, but a nagging doubt began to creep into his mind. He thought back to all the disciplinary decisions he had made over the years, decisions he had always justified as maintaining order. But now, as he sat alone in his house, stripped of his authority and facing serious charges, Howard began to see those decisions in a new light. The faces of the students he had punished more harshly, the ones he had dismissed without a second thought, now haunted his thoughts. It was a slow and painful process, confronting his own prejudices. Howard found himself questioning beliefs he had held for decades. Each realization was like a physical blow, forcing him to acknowledge the harm he had caused. One evening, as Howard stared out his window at the neighborhood he was no longer free to walk in, he whispered to himself, "What have I done?" It was a small step, but it was the beginning of a long journey toward understanding, and perhaps one day, redemption. As the day of Howard's sentencing arrived, the courtroom was filled with a tense atmosphere. Howard sat at the defendant's table, his shoulders slumped and his eyes downcast. The weight of his actions seemed to physically press down on him. The judge's gavel echoed through the room, silencing the murmurs. "Howard Jenkins, please rise," the judge commanded. Howard slowly stood, his legs shaking slightly. As the judge began to speak, Howard's mind raced through the events that had led him to this moment. He thought of Alana, the bright young student he had wrongfully accused and expelled. He remembered the countless other students he had treated unfairly over the years. "Mr. Jenkins, this court finds you guilty on all charges," the judge declared, her voice firm and unwavering. The words hit Howard like a physical blow. He closed his eyes, accepting the verdict. For the first time, he truly understood the gravity of his actions and the harm he had caused. As the judge continued to outline his sentence, Howard's thoughts drifted to the school he once led. He had heard about the positive changes taking place there, changes that had begun with Alana's courage and determination. Meanwhile, at the school, Alana's Voices for Change study group was in full swing. The classroom buzzed with energy as students from all backgrounds worked together, helping each other with homework and discussing ways to make their school even more inclusive. Alana looked around the room, her heart swelling with pride. She saw friendships forming between students who might never have interacted before. She heard laughter and words of encouragement being exchanged freely. Mrs. Williams, who had been observing from the doorway, stepped into the room. "Alana," she said softly, "I just wanted to tell you how proud I am of what you've accomplished here." Alana smiled, her eyes shining. "Thank you, Mrs. Williams, but it's not just me. It's everyone here working together." As the study group session came to an end, students filed out of the classroom, chatting animatedly. The hallways, once divided by invisible lines of segregation, now flowed with a diverse mix of students walking side by side. Outside, parents waited to pick up their children. Mrs. Carter, who had come to collect Alana, noticed the change immediately. She saw students of all races and backgrounds laughing together, sharing books, and making plans to meet up over the weekend. As Alana emerged from the school, her mother pulled her into a tight hug. "You've done something amazing here, sweetheart," Mrs. Carter whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Alana looked up at her mother, then back at the school. The building seemed to stand taller, brighter somehow. It was no longer just a place of learning, but a symbol of what could be achieved when people came together to fight for justice and equality. If you enjoyed the story of Principal Jenkins, Alana, and Mrs. Carter, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.